Xiong, and welcome to the Happier Together podcast. This is episode 2, Hmong Cultural Values and Mental Health Baseline Overview with Xiong. Please note that there will be descriptions of domestic and verbal abuse and mental health in this episode. Some listeners may find this disturbing. If you find yourself feeling triggered, the description box will include timestamps for each topic. This is to empower you, our audience, with the knowledge you need to make healthy decisions about how and if you should consume this podcast content. Many Hmong families in the United States faced isolation after immigration, as it was difficult to learn the language and customs, often leading to minimal usage of social services. Distrust in the service professionals and cultural barriers further marginalized the community, with many people having minimal education on healthy coping strategies. In addition, the Hmong religion is a mixture between animalism and ancestral worship, seeking illness as a spiritual imbalance which many still practice today. Illness is perceived by many in the Hmong community as only related to physical wellness. Therefore, mental health is often not seen as a serious concern, and services continue to go underutilized. Xiong will be describing their experience utilizing and navigating mental health services as a second-generation Hmong American. Let's get into the episode. Today, we have Xiong, who will be speaking on their experiences utilizing mental health services and the after effects that came with that. Joe, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and going over which generation Hmong you are, your educational and career background, and why mental health is important to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Xiong. I have a master's of social work. I am second generation Hmong, so I was born in Sacramento, California. Currently, I've been providing direct mental health services to the greater Los Angeles.
Thanks for being here, Joe. So that actually leads into our first question, which is, what is the general cultural attitude towards mental health in the Hmong community from what you've seen?
I've seen that it's always been stigmatized, meaning that there's always been some sort of discomfort and redirecting and regarding issues in mental health. So quite often you will see that people will comment that mental health doesn't exist when people are experiencing, anxiety, depression, or maybe they're even hallucinating. And so the conversation leans less about mental health and more towards pulling through and doing oning or some other spiritual practice, which I think is also acceptable.
Do you feel like mental health is still a taboo topic to discuss? When you're meeting with patients, is there still some stigma that seems to exist?
I still do think that mental health is such a stigmatized topic. Even in the field, I work with a variety of individuals, and some of them tell me that they don't have a mental health disorder or a mental health challenge, when in fact, they're very depressed or they're experiencing hallucinations or delusions. And it can be very difficult to work with people who have not accepted that they need help and that they have mental health issues. It's also just an additional barrier to work with individuals who stigmatizes mental health, because then there's a fear of seeking help and a sense of shame that stops people from getting the help that they need.
So, from your experiences, what has been the general cultural attitude towards mental health in the Hmong community?
My experience with mental health in the Hmong community and how I've gained observation and judgments from it was through my childhood. There was a point where I was going through a lot and I wanted to seek professional help. My parents were very against it. In fact, they were pressuring me every day for me to tell them what was going on. I did not feel confident and comfortable telling my parents about what I was thinking or going through, because a lot of what was bothering me was related to my siblings and related to my family. There were times where I've tried to talk to my family about things that bothered me, but quite often as a child, I was put into positions of just be told that I was foolish or, that didn't happen. So just a lot of deflection and refusal to acknowledge that my parents just somehow never ever made mistakes. But in fact, they made many mistakes. I felt I couldn't go to my parents and I felt like I couldn't trust them. There is some aspect that my parents were not doing enough or they were not providing enough for me to feel safe in the home to talk to them. And I see this often just hearing about other people's experience where they're not able to go to their parents for help. They quite often seek guidance and help outside of the home because home is quite often dysfunctional. Parents aren't always the best at providing support. It comes off blunt, or maybe there's just a cultural difference because most of our parents came here not knowing anything. They didn't grow up here. They experienced, racism in a different way than we've had to. There's a lot to consider, but my observation has been that people should talk about their problems in the home. You shouldn't take that outside. That's shameful, or you're a bad community member because you sought help outside the community.
Wow, I am so appreciative of you just being so honest and raw about your experience seeking mental health services. I feel like this is such a common experience, especially with the second and third generation Hmong, where navigating these conversations with their parents and their families can just be really difficult. And so, a question that I have for you is when you were seeking those services to address your mental health needs, did you feel like those services were culturally appropriate, or how did you feel like your needs were actually being met once you did go out and seek that external support?
Therapy saved my life. And I say this because I didn't have a safe space for me to talk about what I was going through. Therapy provided a safe space for me to vent, to just process things, to reflect on things, to talk about how to better approach things. My family wasn't really there for me in a sense. Like, yes, there's food and a roof over my head. But quite often, that's a lot of what my parents would say. Yes, I appreciate that. That's important. At the same time, when we have to think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a social emotional aspect of child development that children need. Most of our parents didn't have the opportunity to be educated and to take parenting classes and learn how to help create a healthy environment for their children to grow. And there's just a lot of unaddressed and unprocessed trauma that comes from being a refugee. And I think the reality is that there's a lot of intergenerational trauma that's at play. And again, it goes back to saying that a lot of people don't acknowledge that they need help, when in fact, I think a lot of our community members do need a lot of help with processing what happened during the genocide and ongoing genocide, losing family and friends, and just not having a space to talk about it. It has really affected how a lot of our parents treat us and how they just expect us to, just be okay with things because they've had it worse. That's quite often what I hear a lot. We're not starving, we're not in, an underdeveloped country, so what do we have to complain about, right? But in reality, different needs happen in different environments.
You cannot have described that in a better way. You're hitting the nail right on the head when you're mentioning that there's just a lot of really intertwined issues at hand here, right? So it's not only the first generation immigrants that are experiencing these unaddressed traumas and mental health issues, but then you have the complexity of just navigating through the American culture and society. So they're navigating a new space, new tools, new values, and it's just really hard to navigate everything at once and really prioritize what is important. When at the end of the day, the thing that's most important to a lot of people is just trying to survive. And so it can be really hard to just pinpoint what the actual issue is because it could be a variety of things. And, each circumstance is unique on its own. And so, on that note, do you feel like there are cultural and religious perspectives in the Hmong community that aided the first generation Hmong and how they view mental health?
Yeah, I would say spirituality and religion uh, do have a great influence on how we perceive mental health. My parents, for example, they converted at one point, and my dad was a pastor. There was always a pressure for us to just be good Hmong children. But when I started to get depressed and anxious about going to school, and I had issues with getting along with some of my peers, so did other members of my family, because we lived in a predominantly white neighborhood that kind of just alienated and ostracized us. It was like, oh, okay, well, My parents didn't understand that, maybe not living in a community that, we couldn't connect with, like maybe that was a bad idea. And so I do think that's we were just kind of pushed towards like, oh, just pray for things to go away, or well, at least for my parents, they were Christians. So it was just like praying for things to go away, or like, you have no reason to be upset because, God's always there, for example. And so you just need to read the Bible or deflect into, the devil's just trying to like, take control of you or make you feel bad. When in fact, it's like, well, if the devil's trying to make me feel bad, then, maybe it's like, I guess my brother's making me feel bad. So I guess he's the devil now. Things just didn't make sense. And I strayed away from spirituality and religion because it didn't feel like it was helping me address my problems. And it was often the case of just being told to deflect these problems, which is, can be affected to a certain extent. But the reality was I needed a place to reflect, to process, and to not be judged.
Yeah, and so earlier you mentioned that you did end up seeking mental health services just to aid that aspect of your life and to give you that additional support. And so now that you've gone through that process, how has your community, as such as your parents or your siblings, how has that shifted their perspective in seeing that you've successfully gone through that? Are they more open to it? Or, what does that relationship with them look like now?
Well, when I first got therapy, it was very difficult because it was just like being shamed every day of talking about family problems to a stranger. And that's true, You're talking to a professional stranger about problems that are happening in the home. But at the same time, my parents weren't doing enough to resolve the issues in the home. So I'm going to go outside and get help. And I'm going to go to a place where I'm not going to get judged for saying what's on my mind. And we're trying to just talk about how things make me feel. So, but after I got therapy and my parents separated, my dad one day hit my mom. My mom had a bruised eye, and there were issues in my parents' marriage that led us to living in a domestic violence shelter for about a month. Therapy not only saved my life, but I think it saved my mom's life. And whether she believes in it or not, I think it really did because she had a safe space to talk to someone about what she went through with having to let go of, my dad, because I know my mom loved my dad, but I don't think it was the other way around. So there's processing that, and there's grief, and there's just a lot of trauma of just having to be, abused in such a way from someone who's supposed to love you. And so it was nice to see that my mom was getting help while we were at the domestic violence shelter. Like she was talking about her problems in a healthy way. And I think me seeking help pushed for my mom to get some of the help that she needs. But as far as my other siblings, I don't follow too much. So I don't think that they've sought out the help that I did. I know my older brother did get psychiatric help, but he has not been open to it. And he at one point told me that I should stop going to therapy because I don't need it anymore, which is, and that's where it's like, it's up to me to decide that, not him. So as far as like my other family members, extended family members, I try to encourage them to go to therapy, but only maybe one extended family member has actually listened to me, but the others have been pretty tone deaf. And you can't take a horse to the river to drink water, or however the saying goes.
Most definitely. And honestly, it must have been such a scary and intimidating venture to do this on your own and to seek for that additional support. I completely applaud you for that. And I feel like this is an experience that's not only exclusive to the Hmong community, but just a lot of people who are seeking services and supports for the first time. So it can be really hard to navigate this. What steps did you take to seek services, and how did you know that it was effective for you while you were going through that process?
Well, I think mental health services are a lot more open now than they were back then, even though there's still a huge ton of stigma. I would say that a person in my situation, I'm only lucky that I knew about counseling and therapy because I had a staff member from school suggest it to me, and without them, telling me about the resource of like, hey, maybe you could use, therapy or professional counseling, I don't think I would have been able to get the help that I need, and I would have probably turned out to be lot worse than how I am today. I think everyone could use therapy, and I think people need to, of course, not shy away from being able to talk about what is on their mind and not shy about things that bother them. I think for an individual like me who may need the help but is having a lot of pressure to not do it, I'd say, of course, consider the risk factors. Sometimes people go through a lot worse than I did, or they may go through a lot worse consequences than I would if they sought help. But as far as for me, I am only thankful that my parents didn't kick me out of the house or physically abuse me as a result of seeking help. I mean, I will say there are times where, I was threatened that if I didn't tell them anything, that they would not take me to therapy, but that would be medical neglect. So I did tell my therapist, and my therapist at the time told me that, that would be medical neglect, that they are withholding the care that I need, and that would be considered abuse. So, anyways, I guess my point is, you know, get the help. Just move forward. If someone out there who has mental health challenges, who needs a safe space to process it, go for it because I've never regretted getting therapy. I'm just only lucky that I was not physically abused or kicked out of the home because I sought the help that I need. So I know it's a privilege, even though it's still an unfortunate situation. I still hope that people will do what they can to get the help that they need because at the end of the day, like family can often be the biggest barriers to getting the help that you need. And I'm a big believer that I'm going to do what I need to do to take care of myself. And that's a way for me to show that I want to respect myself. I want to love myself. I want to care for myself. And while family is family, at the same time, sometimes family don't really care about you or they don't know how to take care of you. And that's not fair to you. That shows more about how that they need to do better in terms of being able to understand you as their own child, as their own family member. And if you got to do what you got to do to choose self respect, then I would hope that people in my shoes would choose that route.
Right. And just to backtrack a little bit, what are some key symptoms that individuals can look for, within themselves that they should seek mental health services?
Easiest to kind of pick on are depression, anxiety. I think some clear signs are, are you feeling sad more than half the week? Are you feeling nervous more than half the week? Are you having intrusive negative thoughts more than half the week? Clear signs are, if you have thoughts of death and or suicidal thoughts, then, definitely would that be a clear sign. Maybe you have thoughts of hurting others. That's a clear sign to get help. I want to say a lot of people who think about death or suicide or hurting and killing others, most often than not, our mind resorts to that type of intense level of thinking because we feel stuck in a situation because this individual has put us in a position where we can't get out of it, or we feel stuck in an environment that we don't really have a way of getting out of, and death is a way out. Maybe if you're not showering or you're not eating, or if you're just constantly worried about every minute or more than half the day.
Yeah, and a little bit ago you mentioned that if you need help and your community is not supporting you in seeking that, sometimes you have to just take the horses by the rein and lead it to that direction. So even if that means going against the grain. What kind of advice do you have to stay resilient in those difficult times to do such things that, you're going against what status quo says that you should be doing?
Well, I would say find others outside of the community that who you can connect with. I mean, I'm sure there are other people in the community that may feel the same way and are supportive of you getting the help that you need. And honestly, I feel that I didn't have anyone in my community at the time. So I sought people outside of my community for support because I had to. And people want to believe that, they can live in solitude. And sure, there are a few people who can do that and they don't have to worry about anyone else. But more often than not, many of us do need, some sort of support system. And there's the concept with being queer, for example, that we have to find our chosen family because more often than not, our families that we share the same blood with do not accept us for who we are. And so, a chosen family is being able to be around people who are not by blood related to you, but who are there for you and who are compassionate and empathetic and want to be around you to support you. So, that's what I would say, even in the cases of it's applicable in many different situations. So, for those of us who may be shunned away because we sought to get help with mental health, we're just going to have to, find others who can also be there for us, like our family, because our families weren't there for us when we needed them most.
I agree. Sometimes the hardest thing is just letting go of that toxicity that's in your life and preventing you from being able to seek the services that you need. And so, my last question for you is how can the Hmong community focus on becoming happier together?
The Hmong community can focus on becoming happier together is by accepting that we are refugees, that we have problems that we need to address, and that we're not perfect. And I say these things, and people may kind of just laugh about, oh, we don't think these things, but we do. I grew up in a household where my parents felt like they were perfect, or if they say that they weren't perfect, that they were the best. And the reality was no. If teaching me that, being hit as a result of my consequences of my actions, even if they were simple mistakes, how is that supposed to be perfect? Why is that the best that I'm supposed to learn from parents or, who are supposed to love me? So I do think that, if we as a community can learn to address why we respond the way we have and process things and process our trauma, yes, like the genocide and the war has damaged us so deeply that, it impacts how we treat our kids today. And yes, it can quite often jade how difficult life was back then and how easy it is for the next generation to live here. And so that doesn't mean that our problems are any less than yours. Like, yes, the intensity is life and death from, where many of our parents came from. But as for us, when we think about it, like there have been many times where lots of kids end up committing a suicide. And how is that not life and death in its own? Where we have to consider that the best way out of, our situation is to end up killing ourselves because we had no one who would be down to listen to us, to help us process what we're going through. Yes, it's not living in an underdeveloped country and genocide. But if we can still accept that people can still have problems socially, emotionally, behaviorally out here in the US versus in Laos or Thailand or any other parts of the country, then yeah, we'd be happier together.
Well, thank you so much for being on this episode, Joe. Your insight and honesty has just been so enlightening to hear. I appreciate hearing a real story about how you've overcame the challenges of navigating through the mental health system, despite the Hmong cultural and religious values that may have prevented you from seeking those services when you actually needed them. The key thing I'm taking away from this conversation with you is just the importance of having that conversation and being persistent yet directive about what your actual needs are, because these needs need to be addressed before something severe can happen, honestly. And again, I just want to reiterate how appreciative I am of you and your honesty throughout this episode. And in the description, I've linked to Joe's social information about how you can reach out to them and just to learn more about what they're up to. Thank you all so much for listening to this podcast, and I hope that we can continue to become happier together.